like to speak to us now? Let me know. No? Okay, moving on. We're going to discuss some old business, which is a presentation. And Cliff is going to introduce our speaker.
This is a continuation from the last month's meeting. We had discussion about MOU with the State of North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality Aquatic Weed Division for doing some milfoil treatment. We kind of hit the pause button and hit the brakes on that and decided we needed to come forward with a more comprehensive survey as well as some education about milfoil and 2,4-D and options for treating milfoil other than the use of 2,4-D. So I asked Dr. Robert Richardson, who's a professor of an extension specialist with the Crop and Soil Science Department at NC State, if he would be willing to educate us all. And Dr. Richardson, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
All right. Yes, sir. Very good. So I'll just turn it over to you. And you can share your screen whenever you're, there you go.
Yep. So is that showing up okay? Okay, so yeah, Eurasian water milfoil is certainly not a new issue. If you can't hear me or anything as I go along, please feel free to interrupt me. There are quite a few milfoils worldwide. If you look at this bottom left image, that's a different milfoil species in an irrigation canal in southeastern Australia. So that's a very common problem for them. On the right over here, we have, of course, Eurasian water milfoil. So just a brief introduction on aquatic plants. We often will categorize them in the list that you see here because many of the control methods will be applicable on some of these, but not others. So we can have free-floating plants. Those would be plants that bob along at the top of the water surface. They may or may not have roots, but the roots would not be attached to anything. So that could be like a duckweed or a water hyacinth, something like that. Floating rooted plants would be like a water lily. You have a leaf at the surface and then either a stem or a petiole that goes down and attaches to roots in the sediment. Submersed plants are like Eurasian water milfoil, hydrilla. They start growing at the sediment layer and come up from there. They may or may not come up a little bit above the water column, but almost all their biomass is in the water column itself. Emergent plants would be like cattails that grow in shallow water and most of the biomass is above the water column. And then riparian plants would be things like trees that are maybe like wet soil, but they're not typically growing in the water itself. Now, there are benefits of aquatic plants. They do provide food, shelter, and breeding habitat for fish and wildlife. In general, the more natural the system and the bigger the system, the more important plants are for fish and wildlife. Plants can also offer protection from erosion, stabilize banks, reduce sedimentation. They can provide more clear water by filtering the water. Some submersed plants will oxygenate the water. So, of course, when you have submersed plants like you see on the right, they're conducting photosynthesis. A byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen, of course. But when you have a whole lot of aquatic plants growing up to the surface, like what you might see in the image behind me, it's the opposite effect because only the plants at the very upper surface can get sunlight. Anything down below that cannot get sunlight. So you actually have oxygen demand where the plants that are respiring are pulling oxygen out of the water, but you don't have enough sunlight getting in for photosynthesis down in the water column. So, you know, some plants can oxygenate the water, but a whole lot of plants may do the opposite. And plants can have aesthetic value, so some are pretty and attractive and can be a nice focal point in a natural setting. Now, Eurasian water milfoil is a significant invasive plant in the U.S. Mainly, you find problems with Eurasian water milfoil across the northern tier states, but the eastern part of North Carolina is one example kind of outside of that range where Eurasian water milfoil grows very well and is problematic in a warmer region than where it is typically found. So it is fairly easy to identify. You're looking for leaves in whorls of 4. The leaves will be somewhat feather-like. They're typically a fairly bright green unless they're covered with epiphytes. The stems can be slightly reddish in color. It does have a flowering segment that comes up above the water column that you see in the upper right. So that's typically reddish, very small flowers. You have to be right on top of it to see it. But the leaves will always be in those whorls and very common. Now it does reproduce by several methods: fragmentation, seed, stolons, and the root crowns will typically overwinter and resprout the following year. So it is a weak perennial, herbaceous perennial, and does typically resprout. It can form really dense mats that you see there in the center, and of course native plants can't compete in that. And further up north, there are hybrids of Eurasian water milfoil and a native species, northern milfoil, and those hybrids can be more invasive than Eurasian water milfoil itself. I'm not aware of any of those hybrids in North Carolina or close to it, but those are out there, and just want to make you aware. There's also an avian disease link that's primarily with hydrilla and cyanobacteria, although it's also been found with that cyanobacteria and Eurasian water milfoil, but again, not as common with milfoil as with hydrilla, but that can or has resulted in deaths of waterfowl. Now, again, Eurasian water milfoil has been around in eastern North Carolina for a long time. In 1968, there were 8,000 acres reported in Currituck Sound. 2,4-D was used as a herbicide in 1968. There was a Sea Grant newsletter I found from 1976 that had some interesting quotes in there. One local resident saying experts from Raleigh didn't know what they were talking about. One expert quoted as saying that the Eurasian water milfoil was going to collapse. So I guess just from a superficial overview, the local resident was more right than the expert. You all will have to let me know after this presentation if it's still true about experts from Raleigh. But pretty interesting history in there. And Cliff sent me the article on the right. Again, that's in the 1974 article with some herbicide treatments. One name mentioned in there, Kurt Getzinger, has just recently retired officially from the Corps of Engineers. So he had a long, distinguished career in aquatic plant management and worked with Eurasian milfoil in the Sound back doing his graduate work a long time ago. But again, this isn't a new problem. It's been around a long time. I was involved with a student project in 2010, just doing some monitoring in Currituck Sound. And this isn't overly important, but just showing you the distribution that was found on the right, the darker green, the more dense milfoil in 2010. Now, we do have situations where plants are more invasive or characteristics of plants that make them more conducive to being invasive. Anywhere that you've got large areas of clear, shallow water, those are great areas for plants to come into. So where you have water that's especially 2 feet deep or less, 4 feet deep or less, also plants are going to come in and colonize those areas. We typically don't have limiting levels of nutrients in most of our water bodies in North Carolina. We have either moderate or high levels of nutrients, so that also helps fuel plant growth wherever plants can get sunlight. With introduced plants like Eurasian water milfoil, they typically don't have a lot of natural enemies. There are a few insects that were pests of some of our native milfoils that can be found on Eurasian, however. And then some of our invasive species just have characteristics which make them more competitive than native plants. Some may be able to conduct photosynthesis a little bit more efficiently than our native plants. Some are more shade tolerant, but they may have characteristics that just help drive their growth. So now moving into control, why do we want to manage these at times? You know, this is hydrilla in a lake in Florida. Obviously, you'd have a tough time using that lake for anything that you might want to typically do, whether it be recreation, fishing. If you had an irrigation intake out there, as soon as you turn the pump on, it's going to clog. If you had a house beside that, you know, it's not going to help your property value with that, you know, being outside. This is Eurasian water milfoil, so it can certainly get just as dense as hydrilla in places. So certainly same problems here. In general, there's a lot of different reasons why we might want to manage aquatic weeds. Some of these might be relevant to Southern Shores, others may not be, but across the state, we can run into all these different issues. So just a few examples. So on the left is one of our big reservoirs that's hydrilla blocking whoever owns that house from getting out to the main channel. On the right is one of our big power generation units, and their intake canal was getting clogged up with aquatic plants. If they have to shut their power unit down, that's probably about $1 billion worth of economic damage a day if that plant's not producing power. And this is what their intake grate was starting to look like. So obviously that was turned into a big concern to them if, again, their water intake would be fouled up. So on the left, we've got giant Salvinia in a North Carolina pond. So you're going to have zero dissolved oxygen underneath that thick vegetative mat, and really no other vegetation, no other species beneath that matted giant Salvinia. On the right is hydrilla in Eno River before treatment and then after treatment. Alligator weed is very common in the coastal plain. This is alligator weed clogging up a drainage ditch. So they probably want to consider management there. Obviously, if you have a tropical storm, that ditch is not going to move as much water as it was designed to move with all that plant biomass out there. So there are various reasons why you might want to manage aquatic weeds. So as we move into our weed management decision-making, the use of the body of water is very important. We need to identify all the potential uses and be sure we protect those uses, whether it's irrigation, recreation, fishing, transportation, getting boats out, that sort of thing. Also, weed identification is very important. We have to know our target species. In this case, it's Eurasian water milfoil, but we also have to know if there are any desirable species there that we want to protect. So we want to try to design management programs that will take out our invasive plants, but leave native plants. Another question is, are fish and wildlife being managed in that area? What do we need to do to protect habitat for fish and wildlife populations if those are important to the water body being managed? What is our water quality in the water body, and what do we want that water quality to be? We would like to come out of a management program with improvement to water quality if possible. And then every site's going to have physical and environmental constraints to what can be done, whether it's water flow, slope, things of that nature. And then, of course, there are also economic limitations. What can we afford to spend or invest towards management? Now, approaching management on any site, there is no silver bullet or one-size-fits-all approach to management. So every water body, every town is going to be different. You can't just take a cookie cutter approach and do the same thing in every place. So we need to be really careful that we define the uses and the needs of these systems. And again, natural systems are going to be more complex than impoundments or reservoirs. So the more natural a system is, the more native species we have, the more complex that's going to be. Impoundments and also other human created things, canals are inherently artificial. They're not going to be as natural, even if we want them to be, as a natural lake or a natural creek or whatever. What are our goals? We want to be clear and set reasonable goals. So certainly eradication is a very big word with a lot of promises attached, and we don't want to overpromise and say a weed's going to be eradicated if there's very little likelihood that that will actually happen. Certainly with Eurasian water milfoil in the eastern part of North Carolina, eradication is probably not a realistic goal on any size or scope. So if we're talking about more complex management programs, then technical advisory committees can be helpful. Conduct due diligence, be sure you're implementing good, solid programs and that everything has been reviewed. And for public systems, you need to have public input, public outreach where appropriate. Now, we do need to link plant biology into our management considerations. Each weed species has its own biological characteristics that drive its growth, reproduction. There will be weaknesses in the life cycle where management can be most effective. And these management techniques need to reduce growth of the plant, but also interfere with reproduction. In this case on the right, we've got hydrilla. So if we just go out there and say October and get rid of all that hydrilla biomass, that's all well and good, but that hasn't interfered with reproduction of hydrilla for the next growing season, and you're going to see exactly the same image in October of the next year. So we need to do our management timing when it interferes with reproduction and also reduces growth. So you can take really good management techniques and they can look really bad if you have poor timing. And sometimes management tools that look really good in the short term may not hold up on a year-to-year basis. So in the case of hydrilla, it produces these turions or tubers that can persist for 7 to 10 years. So that's a huge complication for hydrilla management. Eurasian water milfoil is a little bit easier. It does produce seed, but those seed may not be quite as persistent as hydrilla tubers. So anytime we move from one species to another, we have to be very clear about the biology of that. There are a few other species that don't produce seed or turions, and they're much easier to manage than either hydrilla or Eurasian water milfoil. So understanding species biology is very important for targeting sensitive times during the plant's growth cycle. So now just a quick word about vegetation surveys. Vegetation mapping is really important. It's really good to know what vegetation you have before management so that you can evaluate how effective your management techniques have been. And you can define species abundance distribution both over time and also over space, and doing the same type of mapping and survey at different time points, say year after year, then you have something to compare to and see how things are progressing. So in this case, we've got Sharon Harris Reservoir, and we're mapping hydrilla, but this gives us an estimate of hydrilla density and abundance in different parts of that reservoir. This is Roanoke Rapids Reservoir, so we've mapped the weed communities in Roanoke Rapids. So kind of this mustard color is hydrilla and Eurasian water milfoil mixed. And then there's kind of a darkish green color in there that's Eurasian water milfoil alone. So we can map out different plant communities like this and see what we have at any one point in time, and then see how those communities might change if we're doing management or even if we're not doing management. Now moving into the control options that are available. So these are all the general techniques that are available for aquatic plant management. We'll work through each of these, and I'll be a little bit more specific with regard to Eurasian water milfoil. So this is kind of a complicated slide, but just know that as you move from top to bottom, you're moving from essentially no weeds present to being late in invasion down at the bottom, where the water body is completely full of weeds. So at the top, you see prevention. Obviously you need to do prevention before you have any weeds in the system. So it's only going to be effective very early on. So again, prevention, it's often too late by the time we think about prevention, but it is possible to limit human activities and maybe stop this boat and trailer from coming in that has hydrilla on it. But once you have Eurasian water milfoil in your system, then it's really too late for prevention to be effective. Now, hand weeding is probably the most common management form worldwide, but it's also the most inefficient, most labor intensive. Keep in mind that aquatic plants can be up to 98% water. So anybody trying to hand weed is going to be pulling out a lot of water weight. Some places like Eno River State Park tried to use volunteers. They got a volunteer group together, asked them to work downstream trying to hand weed hydrilla. And the group made it about 10 feet before they gave up and said it's just too much effort. So hand weeding can really only be done on a very small scale and only in special situations. Now, mechanical techniques are also available. So there are various mechanical techniques. Most of these are going to provide short-term control only. Some of these also can produce a lot of plant fragments, and species like Eurasian water milfoil can spread by fragmentation. Now, in your all's case, you probably have Eurasian water milfoil in most areas anyway, so fragmentation is not going to be a huge deal. But if you did have other species or new species, fragmentation can help spread those along. The other thing, mechanical techniques are typically pretty non-selective. So you're going to pull out plants. You can also pull out turtles, fish. There tend to be a lot of bycatch with a lot of mechanical techniques. Access, offloading, depending on the mechanical technique, so it's not always viable. Here's a few examples of some mechanical techniques. The guy at the upper left has a chain or bar or something. He's pulling some plants out. We have a small weed harvester that was being used in Puerto Rico, and it would get through several acres in a few month period, and then it would have to go back to the starting point and start again because the plants at its starting point already grown back up to the surface. At the bottom left is a larger weed harvester. You might see these up in New York, New England, or down in Florida. They don't operate much in the Carolinas. And then a cutter bar at the bottom right that might be effective on some of our floating rooted plants. It's not going to be very effective on submersed plants like milfoil because it's just going to chop them up and then they'll form roots somewhere else. So here's a couple of big weed harvesters in Florida. They're not really conducting management per se. They're just essentially chopping down big areas and keeping those big areas open to boat traffic. So more or less, they're mowing their yard, and then the hydrilla will grow back up, and then they'll cut it off again. They're not really trying to decrease the population. They're just trying to maintain it. Now, hydro raking was specifically asked about. I've got a picture of a hydro rake unit over on the right. So, these are called hydro rakes, but is it really raking or is it mini dredging? It might really depend on the operation and the specific site. But as you can see, you're pulling up plant material, you're pulling up debris, you're also pulling up some sediment. So on that small local area, you're getting quite a bit of disturbance. Now you can come in and you can do that on very small areas, but it's going to be pretty high disturbance in those small areas. So some advantages of this is that you're removing the plants, you're removing debris, and you're removing some sediment. So because you're removing that top layer of sediment, you're also going to be pulling out the Eurasian water milfoil root crowns. So you are getting those. Disadvantages is going to be whatever bycatch you have in there, turtles, fish, macroinvertebrates, whatever. Those are be getting pulled out as well. Native plants get pulled out. So it's going to be non-selective, again, that area of operation. It's going to fragment plants. So is that important or not important? It's probably not very important for Eurasian water milfoil, but would it be important for anything else? So the most likely outcome is that you're going to get temporary control of small areas with a hydro rake. And that might be what you're looking for, but you really shouldn't expect long-term control and probably not expect to cover a huge area with these. Now, there are other things like benthic barriers. In the bottom middle, you've got a plastic with holes in it that they're pulling across. On the right is kind of a burlap material that they're using in New Zealand. So these materials can prevent weed growth, weeds coming up from the sediment. They won't be very effective once you get sediment on top of them. And if you have gaps like in the right, you can see a seam in between two layers of fabric, and that's all full of weeds right there in the middle. So this can be used fairly effectively on flat bottoms. You can't use them where you have a whole lot of water flow. If you have stumps or logs or anything like that at the bottom, you can't use them very well either because they'll go over top of those. And they're also very non-selective. So if you do cover up something, turtles or whatever else, they will be controlled just like the milfoil would be. And they're also fairly expensive on a per acre basis, but they're also fairly permanent. So you can extract those costs over time. Triploid grass carp are the most widely used aquatic plant management strategy in North Carolina. So these are introduced fish from Asia. They are sterile, at least the ones that you can stock legally are sterile. You do need a permit from Wildlife Resources unless you stock only a small amount. So the good thing about triploid grass carp is that they feed on most submersed plants. The bad thing about triploid grass carp is that they feed on most submersed plants. So triploid grass carp would not be permitted by Wildlife Resources because they would be expected to escape into the sound and potentially feed on native vegetation in the sound and impact the environment over there. So, while they are a great option for controlling hydrilla in inland reservoirs, grass carp would be a very bad option for southern shores. And grass carp also do not like to eat Eurasian water milfoil. So they're going to eat everything else probably before they turn to Eurasian water milfoil. So they wouldn't be very effective anyway. Now, that brings us to host-specific biocontrols. So there is a milfoil weevil, and it is specific to milfoils, but not specific to milfoil species. So The milfoil weevil is actually a North American native. It fed on northern water milfoil before Eurasian was introduced. It will feed on Eurasian water milfoil. However, it typically doesn't feed at a high enough rate to really control Eurasian water milfoil. So typical outcome is that you get minor suppression of milfoil populations. Maybe 1 year you get something like control, but then the milfoil will come back. So control is inconsistent, generally unpredictable. It may be good some years, may be bad other years. And typically you need hundreds of individual weevils per square meter to obtain control. So you need a fairly high population of those weevils to actually get control. Drawdowns are available, but probably not an option for your part of the world. And then the last option would be herbicides. So we have about 15 herbicide active ingredients that are registered for use in North Carolina. Most of these are plant-specific modes of action, meaning they attack a plant-specific pathway that's not found in animals or insects. Herbicides can be used on a small scale. They can be used on a large scale. In order for these to be registered with EPA, they must be shown that they do not bioaccumulate. So they will not bioaccumulate in either plants or fish or anything else. And again, they're reviewed both by EPA and NCDA. And there's an extensive use history in some water bodies of aquatic herbicides. Gaston, Waccamaw, Tillery in recent years have used aquatic herbicides. Now 2,4-D is the most specific herbicide that you all are probably interested in. It's a very widely used herbicide. You can find it in a lot of lawn weed control products. I just went through earlier, and there's images of 3 turf products on the right that have 2,4-D in them. So 2,4-D was first identified in the 1940s as a herbicide and started being used in some field crops not long after that. It was first available for aquatic use in 1959. And aquatic herbicides in general, have to be re-registered by EPA every few years. So 2,4-D has been re-registered by EPA as recently as 2022, also in 2005. So every time EPA re-registers a herbicide, they review the full data package. They may ask for additional data. They may change the registration, which means they may change the label and the use patterns, rates, that sort of thing. So each one of those intervals is essentially a new registration, a new review for 2,4-D. So 2,4-D is primarily a broadleaf or a dicot herbicide. It usually doesn't impact too many monocots just because they are tolerant based on their vascular structure. It protects them from the auxin, synthetic auxin hormone effect that 2,4-D has on sensitive plants. 2,4-D is available in both granular and liquid formulations for aquatic use. It provides excellent control of some aquatic weeds, such as milfoils, water hyacinths. There's a few others. 2,4-D breaks down by microbial degradation when it's in water. So that's usually a relatively fast process where you have biologically active water. Because it is microbial, it'll be faster breakdown when the water's warmer. So it's all dependent on the microbial action. So the higher the microbial metabolism is, the faster 2,4-D will break down in water. Now, one thing that you have to be cautious about is that there's a lot of different formulations of 2,4-D on the market. I mean, you could see 3 examples there just of the turf products, but there's generic brands. You can find different formulations, different salts of 2,4-D. So you have to be very careful that you select the right formulation of 2,4-D for your use. If you select the wrong one, then you might be more likely to have a negative outcome. So on the right here just shows estimated agricultural use for 2,4-D in 2019 at the top. So it is a corn herbicide, and this makes it really easy to see corn growing regions of the US. And down at the bottom is just use of 2,4-D by commodity and by year. So you can see that 2,4-D is a widely used herbicide in a lot of different commodities and crops. These images are from some research we did several years ago on variable leaf milfoil. Again, a different milfoil species. This one is common in the Sandhills region of North Carolina. We weren't using 2,4-D, but we did use triclopyr, which is a very similar product, has the same mode of action as 2,4-D. So the pictures at the top are before treatment of, it was somewhere in the 2 to 4 acre pond range. One picture's looking in one direction, the other's looking the other direction. And the variable leaf milfoil sends up a little bit more of a flowering segment than Eurasian does. So you can see that greenish fringe coming up above the water. There'd be a whole lot more plant biomass down below that fringe. Top pictures are before treatment and bottom pictures are after treatment with triclopyr, but again, similar product to 2,4-D, so should provide a fairly similar outcome. Both are synthetic auxin herbicides, so they are essentially hormonal in the plants. They cause excessive growth, which results in plant death. Now, herbicide use outcome will depend on many factors, such as herbicide rate, the area that you're treating, water flow, how much dilution you might have, likelihood of reinvasion by plants, species biology, size of the plants at time of treatment, density of plants at time of treatment, etc. So the more plant biomass you have, then potentially the higher the herbicide rate or the lower the impact that you might see from the herbicide treatment. So summary, a formal decision-making plan is beneficial, especially in complicated systems. You know, vegetation surveys are very critical for understanding what you have and monitoring the impact of what you might do. So even if you choose to do nothing, monitoring can tell you, you know, is that the right strategy in the long term, or is your Eurasian growing more and maybe we need to do something in the future? But certainly if you're investing in management techniques, you want to know if those techniques are working. There are multiple management techniques available for Eurasian water milfoil, so the best tool is going to depend on your specific site parameters, you know, how humans want to interact with those systems, biology of Eurasian water milfoil, but a lot of it depends really on what you want to invest and what you want to get out of management. And our management techniques really need to be designed to not only remove the weeds, but interfere with reproduction so you don't get them right back in a very quick manner. We want the management to last as long as possible. So there are, you know, a lot of questions that probably need to be asked. I'm sure I didn't, and there's no way I can answer all of your questions. You know, some of the questions would be, how long could you get control if you're doing a different management strategy? And that might be something that would need to be figured out by repeated survey. But certainly those are things, you know, that can be figured out through monitoring. And if you determine a very deliberate management plan, that can all be incorporated in so that you can evaluate things and get feedback so that you can improve whatever management technique you might try to implement over time. So again, I'm sure I haven't answered all of your questions, but I'd be happy to try to answer any other questions that you might have.
Thanks, Dr. Richardson. We'll start out with questions from council members. Anyone up here have a question for Dr. Richardson?
Yeah, I do.
Go ahead, Mark.
1 year you can have it and the next year there wouldn't be any. Is that common?
Yeah, it's certainly not uncommon. So, you know, Eurasian water milfoil is going to grow based on its environment. So a lot of different factors will go into that, everything from salinity to water temperature, shading. So if you have a lot of cloudy weather at a certain time of year, that can impact growth of some plants. A lot of rainfall can increase turbidity in some systems, and that might decrease plant growth. Certainly tropical storms are going to cause large amounts of disturbance, so that can interfere with plant growth. And then also there could be other natural things that go on. Maybe the plant caught some kind of disease 1 year and that impacted its growth. Maybe 1 year you had a buildup of milfoil weevils and that impacted growth. So yeah, I would say that certainly you should expect to see increases and decreases in populations and distribution abundance of that plant over time.
Okay, and so the winter doesn't matter whether it's 40 degrees, the water won't kill it. Will it come back? I mean, what you're saying is basically it's unpredictable, right?
Well, for you all, winter is probably irrelevant. just did a meeting in New York this weekend, right beside Lake Erie, and their major problem is Eurasian water milfoil. So if Eurasian water milfoil survives winters in Western New York very easily, where sometimes they have 300 inches of snow, your winters are probably not going to have much of an impact at all.
Thank you.
Got a question.
Yes, Paul.
Dr. Richardson, as you probably know, this is a community that's very sensitive to environmental issues. And we have a number of residents that have expressed concerns to us because this 2,4-D was a component in Agent Orange. And frankly, that's concerning to me. Can you comment on that?
Sure. So Agent Orange was manufactured by a few companies at the request of the U.S. military. So the U.S. military essentially gave those companies a demand with specific specifications, and those companies produced a product for those specifications. So Agent Orange had a few different components. 2,4-D was one component, and 2,4,5-T was another component. Now, in the manufacturing process for 2,4,5-T, if you don't have a high level of refinement, you get dioxin production and retainment in the final product. So dioxin is a very toxic, well, it's actually several different compounds, but dioxin is very toxic, both acute and chronic. So in their manufacturing process, there really weren't controls to remove or limit dioxin. So the impact was that they were spraying relatively high levels of dioxin in areas of Vietnam. Of course, a lot of military members were exposed to that, both in the application, but also in handling. So 2,4,5-T was registered as a herbicide itself in the 70s. EPA did pull registration for 2,4,5-T at some point after that. But with 2,4-D alone, dioxin is not a contaminant in that process, and herbicide companies manufacture 2,4-D to meet EPA specifications. So again, there were issues with both the orders that the military gave to the companies and issues with their production process that included 2,4,5-T.
Dr. Richardson, is there any data on if you use 2,4-D, negative effects on non-target flora or fauna?
Sure, and the highest risk from application of a herbicide like 2,4-D would be to non-target vegetation. So dicot plants typically would be sensitive if you're making an in-water application. So do you have any dicot species that are important in those treated areas? There's only a few monocots that are sensitive. It's not many. So primarily it would be those dicots. And other species of milfoil are going to be really sensitive. So in some places in North Carolina, we have rare species of milfoil. So in those areas, we would not use a product like 2,4-D.
What about reptiles, fish, mammals, humans?
Yeah, there should be so the EPA will not say that a pesticide is safe. It's just a matter of risk. So there would be extremely low risk from 2,4-D to any non-plants. So there's a large margin of safety between rates of 2,4-D that are toxic to plants and rates of 2,4-D that would impact non-plants. And again, these products cannot bioaccumulate based on the data that's given to EPA. So even though they impact plants, something that eats a plant is not going to accumulate 2,4-D, and it won't get passed up the food chain.
Yes, Rob.
Dr. Richardson, have there been, and this is kind of a takeoff on Elizabeth's question, have there been any longitudinal studies about the effect on humans? I mean, we talk about other plant species and fauna and flora, but specifically on humans, let's say over a 20+ year period. And, you know, does it have a a sufficient N number of people in the survey to be statistically significant?
Well, I would say that there have been a lot of studies on 2,4-D and other herbicides with relation to human exposure. That's not the direct area that I work in, but I have seen some of those. So again, every time a herbicide like 2,4-D would go through re-registration, EPA would evaluate those trials that have been done and would look to see if there is any increased risk from the last registration review that it went through. And 2,4-D, being an older product, has years and years of exposure history. So there are long-term research trials that researchers do with farm workers because they have the highest amount of exposure, and they track their illnesses over time, which products they're working with. So there are several trials that have documented long-term exposure from various pesticides, including 2,4-D, to those farm workers.
Thanks, Dr. Richardson. Any questions from staff?
I have a question.
Oh, Matt, sorry.
Is there a density level that typically triggers you guys recommending a treatment? Infestation density?
Well, I mean, people from time to time will ask me, what I think they should do or what I would do if I were them. And, I don't want this to come across the wrong way, but it doesn't matter to me whether you all manage or don't manage or which management technique you use. What I would care about is that if you're going to use a management technique, that you use it as well as possible and that you formulate decisions that, are based on how you need to use those water bodies. So, I can't sit here and tell you that you should manage if you get to a certain point. What I would say is, do you get to a certain point where users of your water bodies are impacted? Do you get to a certain point where Eurasian water milfoil growth is so excessive that it blocks out other plants, other organisms? So these are the things that you would need to either document or think about when you're thinking about management. At what point to you all does Eurasian water milfoil really start to impact what you need to be happening from your water bodies? So it's really based on local needs and local goals for your water body, more so than what I think that you should do or not do.
I just thought of one last question. I'm sorry. If we were to use 2,4-D here in Southern Shores for a management tool, what time of year would be the preferred for making it the most effective use of the herbicide?
Okay, so another good question. So typically earlier in the season is when you would want to do that. Once milfoil has grown up to the surface, you're probably going to have to use more product, which means more expense and a higher risk factor since you're putting out more product. So when Eurasian water milfoil has emerged for the season from seed, or whether those root crowns start to grow, soon after that is the timing that I would suggest that you hit, when the plants are small, but after they have started growing for the season.
Paul?
And how is this applied? I mean, is it sprayed, dumped in the water? I mean, what's the process?
So there would be a few different ways to apply 2,4-D, but for Eurasian water milfoil, your options would be to inject a liquid 2,4-D formulation beneath the water surface, or to put out a granular 2,4-D that those products would sink to the bottom and release 2,4-D from the carrier pellets. So either a liquid or a granular put into water. You would not want to do a spray above the water surface.
Oh, Mark.
And just in your experience or whatever is out there that's available, after a treatment, how long does it last before there might be a reoccurrence?
So let's say that you get out a good treatment early in the season. How long that lasts is going to be based on how long before Eurasian really gets reintroduced, or you get strong growth back from seed. So I would guess that you would get anywhere from 18 months to 4 years of control from a good 2,4-D treatment. So if you get a timely treatment out, you're not going to have Eurasian back that growing season. And for Eurasia coming back from seed, it would take it probably a couple years to really become vigorous and start growing to the point that it would impact anything. I would think the same for anybody that might bring in a plant fragment after your treatment, after the 2,4-D has degraded. It would probably take that plant fragment a year or two to really establish into anything that might be a problem. So a general guess would be, again, 18 months to 4 years, but it's not going to last forever. And at some point you would have to do management again.
Any other questions, council?
Good.
Thank you so much for your time tonight, Dr. Richardson. We really, really appreciate your presentation and all the valuable information.
Thank you.
We may be in contact with you with additional questions later, but we really, really appreciate your time.
Sure. Feel free to send any other questions you have.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.